Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of American Culture webinars for English language teachers. We are so delighted that you are here joining us this morning and hope this information that we share with you today will be useful. So just to remind everyone what our webinars are, how these webinars are structured and what the purpose is. The goal of these webinars is to provide information to you on U.S. culture, on topics that maybe you know a little bit about, maybe they're brand new topics to you, but anyway, topics that we hope you will find interesting. And then to help you create an effective plan to use this information to share with your students. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Ray Roberts, who is the Senior English Language Fellow here in Peru. And she will be talking to you specifically about how to use this information that we're going to share today in your classroom and how to engage your students on these subjects. So remember to use your chat so that you can ask questions. And that's why we're here, is to hear your questions and to help you use these ideas. So I'm going to take over the reins of this, and Ray will be back with us shortly. So my first question for you is, what are we going to be discussing today? Now, if you've already read the synopsis, or if you take a good look at these two symbols that we've put here before you, you probably have a pretty good idea about what we're going to discuss. Of course, the topic for today is Women's History Month. And Women's History Month is something that we celebrate in the United States in the month of March. It coincides with the date of International Women's Day, which is celebrated around the world on March 8. But this is a month where we commemorate the history of the equal rights movement for women, the history of influential leaders in our culture. I'm just getting set up here too so I can see your chat. And oh great, now I can see some of the feedback that you gave me in terms of what those symbols were representing. And of course, you're correct. We're going to talk about the role of women, about women's history, and also talk a little bit about the background of the gender equality movement in the United States. And the reason we're going to talk about all of this, or the point that we are sharing this history, is so that as teachers, when you are talking to your students, you have an idea about the history and the process that the United States went through, to use that as a tool to talk with your students and compare and contrast the situations in your home countries, and to give some examples of how different countries have dealt with this issue. So some of the first questions that you might hear when you're talking about this subject, or when you bring this subject up in your classroom, is, why are we just talking about women? What about men? Men have rights too. Or isn't that discrimination to be talking about just about women's rights? Well, that's one of the reasons why we think it is so important to talk about women's history. Women's history and the struggle for gender equality is not about discriminating against men. It's not about creating gender inequality where men are disadvantaged. But it is about correcting and recognizing systemic inequalities that exist in the United States and in many societies throughout the world. For example, I'm going to give you some statistics. These are statistics from the United Nations that might help shed some light about why this is such an important topic. Violence against women ages 15 to 44 causes more death and trauma than cancer, traffic accidents, malaria, and war combined. That's a pretty staggering statistic when you think about it as violence that was perpetrated against women on the basis of their gender. That could be rape or sexual violence, could be honor killings, and any of the myriad of types of violence against women that we see in society today. It causes more death and disease than all of those other elements combined. That's pretty staggering. Another interesting statistic, taking a different look on the economic side, is that out of the top 500 Fortune 500 companies, so the big multinational or international companies in the world, of the top 500, only 13 of the leaders or chief executive officers of those companies are women. Now that doesn't match very well with the ratio of men to women in the population, does it? Another interesting, bringing it home to where I am currently living and stationed here in Peru, I saw a figure earlier this month when we were talking about International Women's Day here in Peru that said out of 1,800 or 1,800 municipal mayors in the country of Peru, there are only 69 women mayors. That's something really profound to think about. So, there's more statistics like where that comes from, like 39 million girls who are not attending primary school. There's a lot of powerful statistics, powerful information that shows even today that the societies we live in are not equal from a gender perspective. So that's a little bit of the rationale of why we're talking about this. But now I'm going to take a different approach, and we're going to go back and look at some of the history of the women's movement in the United States. Shifting gears a minute. So what you see on your screen here are some photos of early leaders, early influential leaders of the U.S. movement for equal rights. And these women were active in the 19th century, so around the mid-1800s. And part of their activism, they were very well-educated, affluent women from wealthy backgrounds in the sense that they had access to education. And really their activism for gender equality was born out of the fact that they were active in other social issues. Specifically at that time, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the two of the women that you see there, met at a conference in London that was about anti-slavery or dealing with the issue of slavery. What these women came across as delegates to this important conference was the fact that they were excluded on the basis of their gender from many of the important votes or elements of the conference. And they, of course, were unhappy about this, about being excluded from this. So together, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott got together and they decided to hold a conference that addressed women's rights. In 1848, about 8 years later, their conference came together in a place called Seneca Falls, New York. And during that event, they drafted a Declaration of Sentiments that was loosely based on the Declaration of Independence, which about 75 years prior was the statement declaring independence of the United States from Britain. And in that declaration, the agenda for the movement was set. So what they were interested in looking at was guaranteeing the right for women to keep their children in the event of divorce, the right of women to testify against a cruel husband in court in a trial situation, the right of women to enter various jobs and to keep the salary, the money that they earned, instead of being required to give that money to their husband. And then, the most controversial of all these agenda items was they wanted the right for women to be able to vote. So something really fundamental that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and also Susan B. Anthony, who you can see on your screen as well, was this important insight that they had, which was that in order to change society, in order to make a lasting change legally, what needed to change first was public opinion. So they really understood that they needed to share their ideas widely. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a very prolific writer, meaning she wrote many books and treaties on these topics. And Susan B. Anthony was someone who traveled around and gave many lectures and was well known for her perspectives. What's important also, we're talking about the mid-1800s here, at a time where there were lots of changes going on in the United States as the United States moved toward the Civil War and the battle between the North and South that was very much hinged on the question of slavery and whether African American citizens should have the same rights or be free. What these women also realized is that when you request freedom or demand freedom and liberty for some groups, you need to demand liberty and freedom for all groups. So their argument was that, like the African American slaves, women in the United States deserve to have protected and well-defined legal rights. And they also believed that a way to achieve this was through universal, free, and fair elections. But of course, progress on this matter was slow. By 1913, 100 years ago, only 9 states in the United States, somewhere telling me you should know this. By 1913, only 9 states that were out in the West had given women the right to vote. Because remember, in the United States, we have kind of an interesting system. We have a federal government, but we also have states that control, that can make specific legislation and can allow, at that period, could allow women the right to vote, even though as a whole, the country had not adopted that law or that position. So the reason why I mention 1913 is because that was a very important year. And now, in 2013, 100 years later, we're celebrating this anniversary of 100 years since the Women's March for Suffrage. Suffrage is a fancy word, or a more advanced word to say the right to vote. So in this picture that you see on your screen, this is a picture of women marching for suffrage, marching for the right to vote. You can see their sashes say across their chest, "Votes for Women." They're arguing not only for women to have the right for votes, but I like to think they're already thinking ahead to when women are going to be candidates, saying, let's get votes for women. The other interesting thing is that you see is that there is a baby in a baby carriage prominently featured at the front of this photo. And what's interesting about that is that one of the ideas that the leaders of this movement used was the idea that showing women with baby carriages and babies would be a less threatening way for women to make their case, showing that these women weren't planning on abandoning their traditional roles as mothers, but they were still advocating for these rights. So at the time, the president at that time, Woodrow Wilson, gave his support for women getting the right to vote in 1918. Then the legislative support was passed in 1919. And finally, oh, here, now I figured it out. We had 36 states at the time. I'll have to send an apology to my 1920, those 36 states ratified the 19th Amendment, which allowed for women to vote. When I say the 19th Amendment, I'm referring to the the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So this was something that went not just onto the books of law, but it became part of the Constitution of the United States. So I want to talk a moment about Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of the most influential women, or I think you can say one of the most influential people in the United States during the 20th century. And Eleanor was one, like some of her predecessors in the women's movement, came from a very affluent or wealthy background. She was well educated. She married her cousin, who went by the name of Franklin Roosevelt, who became a very famous president. But at the time that she married Franklin, Eleanor was very shy. She wasn't really interested in politics or being involved in these activities. But her identity very much changed during World War I, when she became involved as a volunteer in supporting the war effort. Particularly, she was involved in helping soldiers at the hospitals. And these activities, or this commitment to volunteering during the war, really awakened in her a social conscience and an interest in many issues affecting not only the military but other groups in the United States. After that, she began to become more involved in the political realm of her husband, helping him develop his platforms and ideas. She also became involved in women's organizations and in organizing women voters. Remember, because this is right during the time in the 1920s, the early 1920s, as women had just gotten the chance to vote, still there needed to be organization and people out there who were helping to explain these newfound rights and responsibilities to women voters. She even went so far as to organize women voters against her cousin, who was Theodore Roosevelt Jr., when he ran for a position as Republican governor. And this was important when her husband then actually became governor himself, a different cousin, but this one was a cousin that she was married to, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He became governor of the state of New York in 1928. And Eleanor's social activism and her interest in these causes became incredibly important politically to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because it was in 1929, shortly after he took office, that the stock market, the great stock market crash of 1929 occurred and the Great Depression began. So these issues that she was focused on went from just issues that she was involved in as a volunteer, as a community organizer, to really the most important political issues of the day. A few years later, when FDR as we call him, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, took office as president, Eleanor became the First Lady. She was very, very active in this role, and part of that was because her husband suffered from the disease polio that limited his ability to walk, to travel, those sort of things. And so she took on a role of traveling on his behalf and communicating with many groups on his behalf. But she was also very outspoken on her own. She held press conferences, she wrote a newspaper column, she had very active correspondence with many different individuals and groups of people. Of course, this was controversial, but she was also very popular for these activities. She actively campaigned for better treatment of women in the workplace. She also advocated that a percentage of the New Deal the New Deal being an umbrella term for the set of economic and social recovery programs that the Roosevelt administration had put into place. She argued for a certain percentage of those programs to be dedicated toward women. So unlike many of her predecessors as First Lady, she really understood that the role of the First Lady was potentially very, very powerful. So she took on a very different role as the First Lady. When World War II came to be, she was involved in three main areas: refugee affairs, home front issues, and addressing the welfare of soldiers. So I wanted to talk about World War II specifically as a time of great change for women in the United States. What was very interesting during that time is that, excuse me a moment, with so many young men off fighting in the World War in distant locations throughout the world, the United States suffered a deficit in the labor force. There was a great need for women to enter the workforce at that time. And it's very interesting because the government was one of the main recruiters to get women into the workforce. So many of those women were involved directly in the military, but others took on jobs in private sectors or in industries that supported the military, and took on jobs that had traditionally been held only by women. So the government was actively involved in propaganda to recruit these women into the workplace. And one of the themes that they used was patriotism. So on the side here you can see there's a picture of a woman who has her husband standing behind her and an American flag waving in the background. And one of the themes that was used was the government encouraged husbands to feel proud that their wife had taken on a job. Their idea was that they should encourage them. They shouldn't feel bad about having their wife worked, because it wouldn't reflect poorly on them or their ability to provide for their family, but really was a way for their family to help the war effort. What's interesting about this is this concept that the reason why women weren't working was because their husband didn't want them to. So the government also was very focused on the white middle class community, especially in their propaganda, where women were traditionally in roles as housewives. So their idea was that these women were not already in the workplace. The idea was that they would take jobs for a temporary period, jobs that had been held by men, and then when the war was over, they would go right back to where they had been in taking care of their families and in a domestic role. So the real stars of these campaigns were the housewives, the white middle class housewives, who had no work experience but were ready to step into these roles. And you can see on the other side of the screen a very iconic image of Rosie the Riveter. And this is an image of, there's actually a picture here you can see of a woman who is doing the job of a riveter on a US Navy plane. This concept, this was sort of the propaganda or the idealized image of a member of the female workforce. And I like to read a couple lines from a song from 1942 that described or memorialized this concept of Rosie the Riveter. The song says, "All day long, whether rain or shine, she's part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory." And the song goes on to explain that Rosie's motivation is so that her boyfriend Charlie, who is off fighting overseas, can someday come home and marry her. And the implication is then Rosie won't be working anymore after that, because she will be married and go back to a traditional domestic role. So it's very interesting, because despite this need, despite this this economic and nationalistic need for women to enter the workforce, and we're not even talking about the many women who are already in the workforce and who stepped into higher paying jobs and were able to expand their economic opportunities that way. This idea was, the government was never interested in making a long-lasting change, but they were just hoping that they would fill this temporary need, and then women would go back to their regular roles. So, but in reality, this was a change that after this, go back to talking about Eleanor Roosevelt again, because I really think she represents, iconically in many ways, some of the changes that American women went through. So in 1945, a few months before the war ended, FDR, the president, and Mrs. Roosevelt's husband died in 1945. And at that time, Eleanor Roosevelt said, okay, everybody, the show's over. I'm going to go home and I'm going to return to a private life. But instead, she really became someone that the country looked to as a moral leader, as a political leader. And she was asked by the following president to become a delegate to the United Nations, where she chaired the Human Rights Commission. And she was also one of the authors of the Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948. So she was really active in these social causes on an international level, and expanded this this connection between the American struggle, or the struggle in the United States for gender equality, and issues of social concern and of human rights throughout the world. Was really an important leader in that process. In the early 60s, President Kennedy asked her to return to the United Nations. She also chaired his commission on the status of women, where she worked for the Equal Pay Act. And she was just active and seen as a leader for so many people. President Kennedy also nominated Eleanor Roosevelt for the Nobel Peace Prize, although she did not win that award. I don't think she was very interested in awards of that kind of thing. Was really more interested in helping those people whose causes she took up. She passed away in 1968, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry, 1962, at the age of 68. I can see it. All right. So when we talk about the 60s, we absolutely have to talk about the second wave of feminism. If we think of the first wave as what I was talking about earlier, about the movement for suffrage and the focus on some of those legal rights to equality, second wave of feminism broadened that spectrum really dramatically. And they broadened that to include issues of sexuality, of family, of rights in the workplace, of reproductive rights, inequalities of all different sorts. So at this time, when mainstream women, about after World War II, so some of the women that maybe were youngsters during World War II and had grown up maybe with working mothers, or mothers in their community, or women in their community who were taking on roles and were active in the economy, these women grew up and were ready to demand increased equality with their male counterparts in a variety of fields. So this second wave of feminism first began in the 1960s in the United States and took on the name of, was originally called the Women's Liberation Movement, or Women's Lib. It had a lot of different names. And this movement lasted essentially this second wave through the early 1980s. It also was, as countries became, as information shared, just organically emerged in other countries, the second wave of feminism, or these women's liberation movements, also showed up in Europe and Asia and all over the world. So I have a long list of the important legal and social changes that were achieved during the second wave of feminism, or during this period of intense social activity. And if you remember from last week, or excuse me, last month, we talked about the 1960s as a period of intense change for civil rights in general, and we were specifically talking about African Americans and racial equality. So imagine these things as sort of, they're all happening together in the same time. You know, these conversations. How should our society be constructed? So let me just tell you about some of these efforts that took place throughout this time. One of the main efforts that this movement started off with was the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But unfortunately, this Equal Rights Amendment was defeated by individuals who said, if we pass an Equal Rights Amendment, then women would be drafted into the military. And at this time, that argument was enough to derail at the end this movement for an Equal Rights Amendment. But the following year, a few years later, in 1963, there were movements. The woman that is shown, if you can see on your screen, Betty Friedan, who's in front of a sign that says "Women Unite," she wrote a very influential book in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique. And this book was about how it was about the dissatisfaction, kind of the delusion that was felt by the American housewife who had been brought up. Some of you may have seen or heard of Leave It to Beaver. If you think of Mrs. Cleaver in this image, Betty Friedan was talking about the sentiment or the dissatisfaction that women in that position felt about their life, and how how many of them had different aspirations in life. It became a bestseller, and it really galvanized or spurred the women's rights movement. In June of that year, Congress did pass legislation called the Equal Pay Act. Remember, I mentioned that Eleanor Roosevelt had been involved in that. But this act made it illegal for employers to pay a woman less than what her male counterpart would be paid for the same job. There was sort of an underlying discrimination or encouragement for women not to work in these jobs because they could be paid less. Change the name a little bit, even though the work was the same. Change the name of the job and pay a female employee less. With that act, that was made illegal. Although, like many of these things, change didn't come overnight, even with the passage of legislation. And in 1964, the following year, came the passage of the Civil Rights Act. If you remember our previous webinar, we talked about Dr. Martin Luther King and his role in the passage of that important act. But that act also applied to discrimination on the basis of gender. So at the same time, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was established to investigate complaints against this. So women, minorities, individuals of different races and religions were given an opportunity and a recourse, somewhere to turn when they had complaints. They didn't have to suffer in silence. A lot of other very interesting. I could go on forever. Each of these individual acts or individual moments in the human right, in the fight for women's rights could be a whole webinar. But I do want to get to the part where we talk about how to use this information in the classroom and how to apply it to local context. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about modern times and start to try to wrap things up here. So the most important thing, we can talk about recent legislation that President Obama has signed. He just signed an extension of a very important law that was first passed in 1994, which is the Violence Against Women Act, which puts federal money, again, we're talking about resources and protection for people. In this case, this funding is for the investigation and prosecution of violent crimes against women. It imposes automatic and mandatory restitution on those convicted. And it also is funding for women's shelters and recourses, or people who are the victims of gender-based crime. It also can be addressed to male victims who are the victims of sexually motivated crimes or domestic violence. And today, I think that describes sort of where the United States still is working on this issue. I think the issues for women's empowerment today in my country, in the United States, is about safety and security. It's about domestic violence and other issues, but it also includes issues, continues to include issues about access to affordable health care, issues of contraception and what should be made available to women. And it continues to be about economic equality and political voice. If you're following politics or events in the United States right now, the debate over marriage equality for same-sex marriages, which is something that also has roots and is linked to the feminist movement and gender equality movement, is being debated in the Supreme Court. So these are still really current issues. This is not over, this struggle. It's not over in the United States, and it's certainly not over for many countries around the world. I would say most countries. And you can see by my slide, and as I talk to all of you who have dedicated your life to educating young people, I think that the most important thing that we need to help the situation of women around the world is education. So I'm just going to end here by a couple of quotes from the leadership in the United States so you understand where our perspective is these days. And I'm going to read to you what President Barack Obama said this year in 2013 for International Women's Day. President Obama says, "Empowering women isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. When women succeed, nations are more safe, more secure, and more prosperous. Over the last year, we've seen women and girls inspiring communities and entire countries to stand up for freedom and justice." So this isn't about passive struggle. This is about people standing up and fighting for freedom and justice. And of course, the person that I want to mention to wrap up this portion or to remind the story is the story of Malala from Pakistan. And I'm just going to read to you very short words from the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, as she discussed the story of Malala Yousafzai from Pakistan. "Today we stand together with Malala and the millions of other girls and women who are risking their lives to get an education. Girls with secondary schooling are far less likely to become child brides. They are more likely to earn better incomes when they begin working. They will have smaller families, and their children will be healthier. The evidence is clear, and the debate should be over. Closing the education gap is a powerful prescription for economic growth. On behalf of Malala and countless other girls who share her dream, let us continue to champion their right to an education, and let us expose those who would deny it. Together we can build a world where opportunity and education remain a powerful force for progress. Those are the last thoughts that I want to leave you with today before turning it over to Ray so she can talk about these topics in the classroom. So I hope that this has been useful and enjoyable, and I thank all of you that are engaged every day in that powerful force for progress, which is education. So let me turn things over to Ray.
Hello to all of you. We're going to talk a little bit about actually bringing this into your classrooms and what are some ways that you can bring it into the classroom. The first question there is, what are your topics? What are some of the topics that would be good to cover in your classrooms for those of you, most of you who are living here in South America? Most of you are in Peru. Could you type into your chat boxes what some of the topics might be that you could cover that you think would be good for your students while I move on and talk about a couple of the other things, and I'll watch the chat box for your input. So what kind of topics might you cover in your classrooms? We're going to cover also what kinds of questions and conversation starters might you be able to use. We're going to talk about vocabulary that you might need, and we're going to talk about a couple of activities that you could do. I'm not seeing anything in my chat box, so I'm going to move on, and we're going to talk about what some of the possibilities might be for your lesson plans. Certainly education, right? Education is so important, and we're going to talk a little bit about education in Peru. Abuse, and Melissa has already mentioned that a little bit. The right to vote, equal pay for equal work that she mentioned, but also employment opportunities for girls and women. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those. Maybe my chat box didn't move down. Okay. So some possible discussion questions, for example, are, do you think men and women have equal rights? Why or why not? Which is different from, do men or women have equal rights? The question is, do you think they should? Do you think that they do have? Very interesting discussion for students in your classes. I've used this particular question a number of times. Who are the women leaders in your community or in your country? Having students realize the leadership that's all around them. South America already has a rich heritage of women in leadership, women presidents. They're ahead of us in the United States in that area. And there's a lot to be proud of in all of South America in terms of the advancement of women. What challenge do you think that still face women today, and of which there certainly are many? And are those different from your mother's generation or your grandmother's generation? Now, for some of the girls who are in indigenous families, maybe that hasn't really changed so much. We're going to talk a little bit about them. I'm having, get this slide changed here. We have a new platform today. So. Thinking about the vocabulary that might be of interest to them. We're looking at sort of the beginner level here. You've got words like opportunity. All of these are words that they can handle. You might want to break down a word like contribution And what is the base word? Contribute, right? And what is the other word that they know for contribute, which is to give? So moving them from beginner level toward a more intermediate level with some of the vocabulary opportunities. Be sure to pre-teach those before you give them anything else. Let's look at some more advanced ones. We have the 19th Amendment, which we've just talked about, which is from the United States when the vote was given to women. We have the word suffrage, which we use a lot, which is that movement, that group of women who were in the sort of on the ground fighting for the vote. However, that word, if you look at it, S-U-F-F and then rage, is not really how we pronounce it. We pronounce it more as if the word was suffrage, ridge like in the top of a hill, suffrage. So that's one little small thing. A word like empowerment, having them try to find what's the base word there. It's power, right? And helping them understand the vocabulary in that way. I'm going to move fairly quickly. We're a little short on time today. I do want to tell you a lot about this particular event, the Women's Day, that was held in Tarapoto. And my counterpart up there, Ryan Bruce, had a wonderful project that he did. And what the students did is he gave them each a short reading, it was about a page long, with some statistics about Peru, and so that they could first understand what the International Women's Day is and to develop the vocabulary. But they followed that with a really wonderful project. And we'll get that on the screen for you in just a second. Each of the students were given a piece of cloth, and on that piece of cloth they could put on their writing, their pictures, what they felt was something that they could express about the International Women's Day. I'm apologizing, that's taking a while for that slide to come up, but it will get there eventually, hopefully. There you go. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner one of the older students who had brought in a picture of her mother. And they had told them the day before to, if they wanted, if they could bring in pictures of women leaders or important women in their life or in their country. As you can see down below, you can see "We Must Respect Women" is one of the cloth pieces that one of the students did. And in the background, you can see a group of students there with their finished product. One of the things that they did was to add purple ribbons to those. And the purple ribbons are representative of domestic violence and of the women and children who suffered at the hands of violence in their homes. Here you have a picture of the finished product. And one of the things that's so important, this was hung on the walls, it was then put onto a larger cloth and hung on the walls, is publishing your student work. Being able to have your student work up so others could see it, and also that this is a daily reminder of this is the kind of concrete, contextualized work in English that the students are doing. The students are completely, thoroughly engaged, and they're learning vocabulary, they're learning grammar, they're learning to read, they're learning to write and express themselves at the same time that they're doing a project like this. I want to talk to you about another project, which is, it's called Girls Rising video trailer. They're just in Peru recently, about 1 or 2 weeks ago. There was a movie that was reviewed here called Girls Rising. It's a documentary about girls' education around the world. And it's centered partially on an indigenous girl here in Peru. Oops. We have something different than the slides that I have. Okay. Asking the girls before and after questions about the video. But this video talks about one particular girl named Sena. And as if we have a picture of her coming up. Maybe. One of the things to do with lower level students is to use the picture to have, if the reading load is too heavy for them, to just use a picture, have them discuss the picture, have them talk about what they know about the topic, or to develop their background information about the topic as well. I'm sorry that our slides are moving up too slowly this morning. So I'm trying to move through them for you. Let me give you some of the statistics that were in an article there while we're waiting for this next slide to move on. One of the things it said was that of the indigenous girls, of Quechua-speaking girls, that only 30% of them are in secondary high school. And of those girls who are in, there's our picture, of those girls who are in indigenous communities in the Amazonian area, that only 9.5% of them are in secondary school. So this is a picture that you could use. This is Sena, who was in this photograph. And I'm going to go ahead and try to click this slide since it's taking a while. This one came right up. This is part of the reading that was in that article. And I have given you some ideas about how to modify this text. For example, you can see the words in yellow. Those words in yellow are words that I put in because I crossed out the words before them. For example, Sena is a teenager from the icy peaks of Rinconada. Icy mountains might be easier for an intermediate reader. Or the next yellow word, never acquiring any gold for themselves, never having. I'm just substituting down, using a somewhat easier word. Her father is adamant, and I use the word believes, that Sena should go to school. One way to take an authentic reading, which is especially interesting for the students, to be able to have authentic readings and not always just ESL produced readings. You can also see that I've scratched out some of the lines to make it easier as well. You could also, for lower level students, you could just take the first part, the first half of that, which is certainly they're all able to be able to do that. Sena is a teenager from the icy mountains of Rincona. Her mother and father spend their lives hammering rock in the gold mines with never having any gold for themselves. Her father believes that she should go to school so that she can do better than him. Just stop right there. You could use that for the lowest level. Or leave it completely as it is. Take out everything that I've put in and used it for your advanced students. Just take it directly. So you can modify text. Don't shy away from trying to use authentic materials. So I've rushed through that, and we're right on time. So, and I haven't had a chance to get any of your questions, but I hope that you take the leap, bring in these kinds of topics into your classroom. This kind of contextualized learning is very engaging for the students, as well as very profitable for them in terms of what they have a chance to learn. I'm going to turn this back over to Melissa for just a minute for her to be able to say goodbye to you. Yeah, if we have some questions, we'll try to. Yes, Rincona is located in Puna, yes. And I see that there also, the video link is there, and I believe the video link is earlier also in this. And you'll be able to get this full amount later when it's posted, the full PowerPoint.
I think I took a little bit too long, as happens, as I get really excited about talking about these subjects with you. A number of people are commenting about the challenge of talking about the rights of women, talking about it with men and communities, especially amongst indigenous communities in many of the countries that we live in. And you know, that's part of the reason why Ray and I wanted to talk about these important topics, because we wanted to give you some tools for how to talk about this in your classroom. We recognize that it is a very difficult subject, but I think a lot of you have the right idea, which is that it's talking about respect, talking about rights, and how our students can talk about what kind of society they would like to live in. And you know, not all of the students might agree with your perspective as a teacher or other members of the class, but it's so important to talk about these things and share with them. Particularly, I think the Girl Rising video shows that this is not just a problem in one country, but it is a problem that's faced by young women around the world. And I think that that is a really useful tool for talking about it, because sometimes people see in the story of one young person elements that could apply to their lives. And it's not something that just teachers or an embassy can solve. It's really a project that we all have to be engaged in as members of the community. So I want to remind you about some of the resources that we have to further this discussion, because what we hope with these American Culture webinars is that this just encourages you or excites you to look for more resources about the topic and create new lesson plans and ideas that are so creative and imaginative that we haven't even thought of them here. But I want to remind you about the American English webpage, which is part of the State Department's set of web pages, and also the wonderful Relo Andes webpage, where you can get the slides from this presentation. There's also a very interesting website that is linked to the National Women's History Museum in Washington, D.C. And that does have some resources that maybe are more directed to advanced students, because they're designed in English for American classrooms in the United States. But it might be interesting. There's also a lot of resources about individual women, biographies, and that sort of things that are really interesting to look at. I'm trying to see if there's any questions that we can maybe answer that we might have missed here. Those links are coming up. And just remember, you can look at these webinars and all the different resources on the Relo Andes blog. And next month, we'll be back for another American Culture webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We hope it was useful for you, and have a peaceful Semana Santa. Thank you.